John Wayne once paid $90 for a piece of burned, rusted junk, and an entire auction room laughed in his face. Experienced collectors, seasoned dealers, people who had been in this business for decades. Every single one of them thought he had lost his mind. They whispered, they pointed, they laughed out loud. John Wayne just smiled, picked up that old sheriff's safe, and walked out the door. And that night, when he cracked it open alone, that smile made complete sense. But before we get into it, tell me in the comments, where are you watching this from? And if you haven't subscribed yet, hit that button right now. Because this story is one you don't want to miss halfway through. It was a dry, dusty afternoon in a small town in the American Southwest. The kind of town where the wind carries the smell of old leather and history. The kind of place where time moves a little slower, and the past feels like it's still breathing. The year was 1971. A local auction house had set up in what used to be an old saloon. Wooden floors worn down by decades of boots, walls covered in faded photographs of cowboys, lawmen, and frontier life. The ceiling fans turned slowly overhead, doing almost nothing against the heavy desert heat. The room was packed, but not with ordinary people. These were serious collectors, men and women who had spent their entire lives hunting for rare pieces of the American West. Dealers who knew the value of a single bullet casing from the right era. Treasure hunters who could spot a genuine frontier artifact from across the room. These people did not make mistakes, and they certainly did not waste money. One by one, items went up for bid: old revolvers, sheriff's badges from the 1880s, wanted posters with names most people had forgotten, letters written by outlaws. Every item had a story, and every item found a buyer quickly. Then something different came out. Two workers carried it in from the back, struggling under its weight. A safe, old, beaten, covered in rust and dark burn marks from what was clearly a serious fire at some point in its past. The iron was warped along the edges. The handle had melted slightly out of shape. One of the hinges was barely holding on. The auctioneer cleared his throat. "All right, folks. Next item. Old sheriff's office safe. Fire damaged, lock mechanism unknown, sold as is." He paused and looked around the room. Silence. Then, laughter. Someone from the back called out, "Is that even a safe or just a piece of scrap metal?" More laughter followed. A few collectors didn't even look up from their programs. Dealers shook their heads. The auctioneer tried to keep things moving and opened the bidding at $20. Nobody raised a hand. He dropped it to $10. Still nothing. The room had already decided. This thing was worthless. What nobody in that room fully realized was that John Wayne had been standing quietly near the back wall for the past 20 minutes. By 1971, John Wayne was one of the most recognizable men on the planet. He had made over 150 films. He had won the Academy Award for Best Actor for True Grit just 2 years before. He was the face of the American West, on screen and off it. But what most people didn't know about Wayne was that behind the cameras, he was deeply passionate about the real history of the frontier. Not the Hollywood version, the actual history. Wayne had spent years collecting authentic Western memorabilia. Old firearms, genuine lawman badges, historical documents. He had a deep respect for the men who actually lived that life. The real sheriffs, the real outlaws, the real cattle drivers. To Wayne, these were not props or decorations. They were sacred pieces of American history that deserved to be preserved. That's why he was at this auction. When the workers first carried that rusted safe onto the floor, most people in the room looked away. But John Wayne looked closer. His eyes moved slowly across the surface of the safe. He studied the burn pattern. He noticed something about the shape of the door. He saw markings on the side that others had dismissed as rust damage. He said nothing. He stood still, arms crossed. That familiar, calm expression on his face that people who knew him recognized immediately. It was the look he got when he had already made up his mind and was simply waiting for the right moment. When the auctioneer dropped the opening bid to $10 and got no response, Wayne slowly raised his hand. A few heads turned, then more. Within seconds, the entire room was looking at him. The auctioneer, surprised, pointed in his direction. "We have a bid. Do I hear any advance on $10? Silence. Wayne raised his hand again. $90, he said quietly. Just like that. No drama, no explanation. The room erupted. Not in competing bids, in laughter. People nudged each other. Someone actually pointed. The auctioneer looked almost embarrassed on his behalf. Nobody competed. The gavel came down. John Wayne had just bought the most laughed-at item in the entire auction for $90. The laughter didn't stop when the gavel came down. If anything, it got louder. As Wayne moved through the room to arrange transport for the safe, people approached him. Some were curious. Most were amused. A few couldn't help themselves. One seasoned dealer, a man who had been buying and selling Western antiques for over 30 years, walked straight up to Wayne and looked him dead in the eye. "You do know that thing is completely destroyed, right?" he said. "Lock's probably fused shut from the fire. Even if you get it open, there's nothing inside. Never is with these. You just wasted $90 on scrap metal, Duke."
Wayne looked at him for a moment, then smiled, just slightly. The kind of smile that doesn't need any words behind it. "Maybe," he said, and walked away. That was it. No argument. No explanation. No defense of his decision. Another collector shook his head nearby and said loudly enough for people around him to hear, "I've seen a lot of strange buys at auctions, but that right there might be the strangest." More laughter. More head shaking. Wayne arranged for two men to carefully load the safe into his vehicle. He watched them handle it and quietly told them to be gentle with it, not because he was worried about damaging a piece of scrap metal, but because he already knew what it was. As he drove away from that dusty auction house, the laughter was still echoing behind him. He didn't look back. That calm, quiet smile stayed on his face the entire drive home. Because John Wayne had seen something in that safe that an entire room full of experts had completely missed. And tonight, alone, he was going to prove it. That evening, Wayne had the safe brought into a private room at his ranch. He didn't rush. He never rushed. He pulled up a chair, sat down directly in front of it, and just looked at it for a while. Up close, the damage was even more visible. The fire had clearly been intense, the kind of blaze that destroys everything around it. The outer iron surface was black in places, deep orange with rust in others. The door had warped slightly inward from the heat, but the structure itself, the core of the safe, was still solid, still intact. And that's exactly what Wayne had seen from across the auction room floor. He ran his hand along the side of the safe. There, partially burned, but still visible, were markings stamped into the iron. A sheriff's star, a county seal, a serial number from the late 1800s. This safe had not come from a random hotel or a storage room. It had come from an actual frontier sheriff's office. And whoever had built it to survive. Wayne gathered his tools. A professional locksmith friend had given him guidance before. He worked slowly and carefully, not forcing anything, not rushing the process. The lock mechanism was partially damaged from a fire, but had not fully fused. With patience and the right technique, it could be opened. An hour passed. Then another. At some point, around midnight, something shifted. The mechanism gave. Wayne felt it before he heard it. A subtle movement inside the door. He paused, set down his tools, and with both hands slowly pulled the door open. It resisted at first, the warped metal fighting against him. Then, with a deep, heavy groan, the door swung open. Wayne sat back, looked inside, and the smile returned. The inside of that safe had been completely protected from the fire outside. Sealed tight by pure iron, it had become a time capsule. Untouched, preserved, waiting. The first thing Wayne carefully lifted out was a leather document pouch, old, dry, but completely intact. Inside were official papers from a frontier sheriff's office dating back to the 1880s. Signed arrest warrants, transfer documents for prisoners, a handwritten log of crimes and punishments from a small western county that no longer existed on modern maps. These papers alone were historically priceless. But there was more. Beneath the document pouch was a badge. Not just any badge, a genuine hand-stamped sheriff's star from the 1870s. Heavy solid silver. The kind of badge that was individually made by craftsmen. No two were exactly alike. Wayne turned it over in his hands slowly. On the back, a name had been engraved. A real sheriff. A real man who had carried this badge through real frontier justice. Then, wrapped carefully in old cloth, a revolver. A Colt single-action army. The famous Peacemaker. Original finish, still partially intact despite everything around it being destroyed. The handle showed years of real use, not display use. This gun had been carried. It had been drawn. It had been a working tool of the law in the American West. And, at the very bottom of the safe, a small tin box. Inside the tin, a collection of coins. Gold and silver pieces from the 1800s. Some rare. Some incredibly rare. Wayne sat on the floor of that room, surrounded by history. Real, authentic, irreplaceable history that an entire room full of professional collectors had laughed at and walked away from for $90. He knew. He had known from the moment he saw that sheriff's seal on the side. The crowd had been looking at a burned safe. John Wayne had been looking at what was inside it. This story tells us something important about John Wayne. Something that his movies always hinted at, but his real life confirmed. He was not just an actor playing cowboy roles. He was a man who genuinely loved the American West. Not as a fantasy, but as a real history filled with real people who deserved to be remembered. He collected authentic artifacts because he believed these things mattered. Because he understood that when the last person who remembers something is gone, the only thing left is the object itself. Wayne once said, "Courage is being scared to death, but saddling up anyway." And in many ways, that applied to more than just the screen. It applied to moments like this one, where everyone in the room told him he was wrong, and he saddled up anyway. Throughout his life, Wayne had a reputation among serious collectors for having an eye that most people simply didn't have. He didn't follow trends. He didn't buy what other people told him was valuable. He studied. He researched. He looked closer than everyone else. He understood that real value is almost never obvious at first glance. That the things worth having are usually the things other people have already walked away from. That philosophy, quiet confidence, independent thinking, letting results speak instead of words, was John Wayne on screen and off it. The characters he played were not that different from the man himself. Real men don't explain themselves. They let results do the talking. Word spread quickly. Within days, the story of what Wayne had found inside that $90 safe was moving through collector circles like wildfire. The dealer who had told him he wasted his money on scrap metal heard about it first. By all accounts, he had very little to say. Wayne did not sell the contents. Not a single piece. He had the documents professionally preserved and archived. The badge was cleaned and displayed. The Peacemaker was carefully restored by one of the finest gunsmiths in the country. The coins were authenticated and cataloged. Everything found a permanent home in his personal collection, alongside other rare pieces of genuine Western history that he had spent decades gathering. Years later, after Wayne's passing in 1979, portions of his collection were evaluated by historians and auction experts. The items from that $90 safe alone were estimated to be worth tens of thousands of dollars, with the Colt Peacemaker and the original documents carrying the highest historical value. The safe itself, burned, rusted, fire-warped, was kept as well, because Wayne understood that the safe was part of the story. You couldn't tell the story without it. That old auction house in the Southwest probably saw thousands of items pass through its doors over the years. But none of them came with a lesson quite like this one. John Wayne didn't need anyone's approval. He walked into that room, saw what others couldn't see, paid $90, and walked out with a piece of history. While everyone else was busy laughing, he was busy winning. And that's the thing about legends. They don't chase applause. They just do what they know is right, and let the world catch up later. John Wayne lived that way on screen. And as this story proves, he lived that way off screen too. So tell me, what do you think was the most valuable thing inside that safe? Drop your answer in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this story, make sure you're subscribed. I've got more incredible untold stories coming your way very soon.